Renaissance, and on behalf of the Sierra Club Atlantic Chapter and our local Finger Lakes group, I would like to welcome you. Our featured speaker is Dr. Raymond Vaughan. He's a professional geologist and environmental scientist in Buffalo.
I hope you all enjoyed science class in high school. What I'm going to give you today is what I hope is a short version of that. But this is an issue where details of science are really important. So I'll try to go through this quickly, but bear with me here. I also need to read from my slides, so I'm going to retreat a bit back in this direction. So just starting from the beginning, going back to some basics, most of the atoms in the world we live in are stable, they're not radioactive. But a tiny fraction of 1% of the atoms we encounter in everyday life, hopefully in small quantities, are radioactive. And one of the ones that everybody's exposed to, of course, is potassium-40, the radioactive version of ordinary potassium that's an essential nutrient. But of particular interest today are, of course, radium and radon. And those are two members of the radioactive decay chain we need to be concerned about here. So we won't spend too much time on this. I think this will be posted online, won't it, Rachel?
Yes.
Okay. So if anybody wants to consult this afterward about some of the radiological terminology, you can do so online. I think Rachel will make that information available. One of the measures that you'll see quite often in measuring emission from radioactive substances is the Curie or the picocurie. A picocurie is 1/trillionth of a Curie, so it's a pretty small measure of radioactivity. But that's what you usually see expressed for the measures of radioactivity, or just activity as it's often called. In dealing with human health, though, what you need to be concerned about is the dose received by the individual. This is a somewhat different concept. It has to do with the alpha, beta, and gamma radiation actually interacting with human tissue. The units there are different. It's the rem or the millirem. And as you can see in the text at the red at the bottom here, the pathway by which people are exposed is an important factor here. Without knowing the exposure pathway, if there is indeed one, we really can't establish what the human health effects are. And that's part of what needs better attention at this site. The different forms of radioactivity, alpha, beta, and gamma, have different penetrating powers. With alpha having very little penetrating power, it's a big, massive particle actually. It's 2 neutrons and 2 protons. But a piece of paper will usually be enough shielding to stop it. Beta is more penetrating, and gamma, which is a photon, like ordinary light or an X-ray, is much more penetrating. But one of the things to be concerned about is that if radioactive materials, such as radium or radon or one of its byproducts, is inhaled or ingested, there you have the radioactive material emitting beta or alpha particles inside the human body where there's no shielding. And that's what the concern is primarily with alpha and beta emitters. So as I already indicated, the exposure pathway is what's really important. And in this case, the exposure pathways from Hakes have not been adequately identified. And high levels of radon within the leachate are one of the concerns. Another concern is high levels of radium, or a lack of knowledge of exactly what the levels of radium are within the landfill have not been adequately addressed. More testing is needed to establish that. And it all comes down to the exposure pathways. And again, this needs to be part of the EIS process, establishing what the exposure pathways are and what the quantitative measures of exposure are. The ones we're most concerned with at the landfill from the fracking waste are members of the uranium-238 decay chain. And you really can't see this with the poor resolution on the screen here, but there's a series of radionuclides starting with uranium-238 that gradually turn into lead-206. So what happens is an original atom of uranium-238 will decay after some length of time. For uranium, it typically is a very long time. it will decay into the next atom on the list here, and so on and so on and so on. It's sort of like the begats, except instead of having the parent have a child that is separate from the parent, in this case the parent atom actually turns into the daughter or the progeny atom. So moving down the list to radium-226, that's part of the fracking waste that is inevitably brought into a landfill that's accepting such waste. Radium-226 will turn into radon-222, which in turn turns into another very short half-life radionuclide, which in turn turns into lead-214, which in turn turns into bismuth-214. And it continues on until it reaches lead-206, which is stable. So there are many steps, as you can see in this list here, even if you can't read them exactly. But it's the sequence from radium to radon to lead to bismuth that is particularly concerned, although the ones further down the list are even more of a health concern beyond bismuth-214. But what I'll be talking about today is how we are looking at the data reported from Hakes and understanding better than they have explained to us exactly what the levels are in the waste that's been disposed of here. So here's just another version of how this decay chain can be portrayed. But I need to get into a couple of concepts here. One is called secular equilibrium, and that is the well-known fact among scientists who have studied this, that when you have any member of the uranium-238 decay chain sealed up either in tight rock or in a sealed container for a considerable length of time, the activity or radioactivity is measured in picocuries of all the members in that chain will be chugging along or ticking along or decaying along at the same rate as measured in picocuries. And even if one of the daughter members or progeny is initially absent, it will gradually catch up with the parent as long as it remains in this sealed condition, either in tight rock or in a sealed container of some other type. So this graph, for example, shows the red line. That would be the parent at a relatively constant radioactivity. And then if it's in a sealed container with the progeny or daughter radionuclide that's shown in the blue line, then over a period of time, the daughter or progeny will catch up and have the same rate of emission, same rate of decay as measured, for example, in picocuries. But on the other hand, if you don't have them sealed up together, if you just have a certain amount of radium, for example, without its parent being present, the amount of radium will gradually decline as it decays away to radon and the other members of the chain. So there's a characteristic curve, an exponential decay, that you can see here for radon, for example. If radon is separated from its parent radium, then it will gradually decay away, with about half being gone every 3.82 days. So in about 7.6 days, 3/4 of it will be gone. Add another 3.82 days onto that, a little over 10 or 11 days, and about 7/8 of it will be gone. This is the nature of radioactive decay. Unless it's continually replenished from further up the decay chain, it will gradually decay away. So we're talking about very short time periods for radon, but for the parent radium, with a so-called half-life of 1,600 years, it's much longer. You may not be able to read the scale along the bottom. The horizontal axis is the time axis. Here it's scaled in years. So from year 2000, you have to look forward about 18,000 years into the future before it's come way down to the point where you see it at the right edge of the graph. So same general idea. There's a slow exponential decay, but it's much, much, much slower for a long half-life material like radium than it is for radon. But for example, if you just look at radium over a period of a century from the year 2000 to the year 2100, then it looks pretty flat. You're actually seeing the same curve here and here. But when you're just looking at a little piece right here, it looks pretty steep, but if you're just looking at it for a century instead of 18,000 years, then it looks very flat, just reflecting the fact that radium has such a long half-life. And part of what that means is that any radium that's going into Hakes Landfill is going to be there at the same activity, or very nearly the same activity, for a long, long time. What this graph shows is that if we wait a century, it declines to about 95 or 96% of its current activity. But it's a long, long wait before it gets down to negligible levels in the order of thousands of years. But then if we continue down the decay chain, as I mentioned before, you go from radium to radon to another very short-lived radionuclide, then down to lead-214, then down to bismuth-214. Both lead and bismuth have very short half-lives on the order of 20 minutes. So this graph and the next one show the very similar decay periods for those. And after about 5 hours, essentially all the lead-214, or essentially all the bismuth-214, would be gone, if not continually replenished from the decay of radon above that. So what is said here is, on the slide, is essentially what I've just been saying, that if you see any lead-214 or bismuth-214 in the sample that's being tested, any measured amount of that has got to be less than about 5 hours old, because unless there's replenishment from the parent, it won't be there. It will have decayed away. And the point at the bottom is that if the parent radon actually is present along with the measured amount of lead and bismuth, then it must be at about the same activity, especially if the sample has been sealed, as these Hakes analytical samples generally are sealed, for about 21 days before testing. So think about what I'm saying here. The Hakes samples are collected, they're held in a sealed container for about 21 days, and after that 21-day period is when the testing is done. The testing results show lead-214 and they show bismuth-214. 21 days after sample collection, this cannot be original lead-214 or bismuth-214 that was present at the time of sample collection. It must be young, less than 5-hour-old bismuth or lead. So since we're finding it, it must be continually regenerated within the sealed sample jar from the presence of radon. So it's an important lesson. It may be a little bit too much to take in at this late hour of the early afternoon, but that's a key to what I'm about to say next. As I say, we're going to apply this now to the Hakes landfill. And this just reiterates what I just told you, that since these samples were held 21 days before testing, the lead and bismuth results indicate that the levels that they were measured at, which was over 6,000 picocuries per liter in some cases, there must have been that same level of activity of radon at the time of sample collection. There must have been that same level of activity at the time of sample testing as there was of the measured bismuth and lead. So if bismuth and lead were at 6,000, the radon at the time of testing also had to be around 6,000 picocuries per liter. You can't see the results here very well, but you can see a little bit, maybe at the far right, both bismuth and lead tested high, where the blue line extends up to over 6,000 picocuries per liter for both bismuth and lead. This is in the so-called unfiltered samples. The filtered samples show the same thing for a different set of samples. It's actually the third set over from the right. You can see one of the blue lines is high. It's coming down then for the more recently tested samples from the leachate. So as I say, these are bismuth and lead results tested after a 21-day sample hold period, showing over 6,000 picocuries per liter. So one of the questions is, why are we just seeing bismuth and lead intermittently high? One possibility is that the sample vials were not tightly sealed, that they were leaking. Or perhaps simply there was too much headspace in the vials after they're filled with liquid. Either one of those would have led to loss of radon out of the liquid sample, out of the leachate water sample. And that's a possibility. We can't know without additional testing whether the intermittently high bismuth and lead data indicate leakage of radon, or whether the landfill itself is high at times and much lower at other times. You know, either one of those leads to different sorts of tests and different sorts of questions that need to be answered. So it's important to have additional testing to resolve whether the vials were properly sealed. We can never establish that for the past, but moving forward, we need to know whether radon is continually high or only intermittently high in the landfill. So the test results also show in these leachate samples that radium, which is the bearing of the radon, is very low, less than 10 picocuries per gram generally. If that's the case, if the radium is only 10 picocuries per gram, it cannot explain how the radon could have been as high as 6,000, because in a sealed container, you should have a pretty good degree of secular equilibrium, meaning they're going to be all decaying at the same rate. So the parent radon and the parent radium and the progeny radon ought to be the same, not 10 in one case and 6,000 in the other. So here's the first big extrapolation or conclusion that we can draw from what I've been talking about. And that is, this is the point in time after 21 days, showing the radon level is 6,000 picocuries per liter in leachate. What we can do is extrapolate backward, because this is radon that did not have the parent radium there to replenish it, so it has to be declining in about the same kind of decay curve as we looked at a few minutes ago. We can work backward and determine that the radon in leachate at the time of sample collection must have been around 270,000 picocuries per liter, way above the 6,000 that we can establish was in the sample at the time of sample testing 21 days later. So the question that I posed before, is the radon intermittently high or high most of the time in the landfill? We really don't know without further testing. But if it is high, it's not just high at a level of 6,000, it's high at a level of about 270,000 picocuries per liter in the leachate. This is a number we've never seen or even seen hinted at in the results that I've seen from the Hakes landfill. So this is the type of question that really needs much greater attention than it has received. It's certainly way, way above anything that anybody would consider background radiation levels. So radon is a gas, as I think you know. Radium is a solid. The other members of the decay chain we've been talking about are solids at room temperature, but radon is a gas. And like other gases, radon can dissolve in water, or for that matter, can dissolve in leachate, as we've just been talking about. And this has some other additional implications. You have a gas regardless of whether it's oxygen in the air, or nitrogen in the air, or methane, or radon. When you've got it dissolved in liquid and you put it in a sealed container, some of that will move into the airspace above the liquid. Or conversely, if there's radon in the air and you put it in a sealed container with some pure water, some of it will dissolve into the water. And there are well-known ratios between what goes into the water and what stays in the air, or vice versa, based on either the partition coefficient or Henry's law. And what we see here, and this is a slide that's bold enough that you can all read it, I think. What you can see here is that if radon is in water at 270,000 picocuries per liter, it's going to be in the overlying air, if you give it enough time, at over 1 million picocuries per liter. So based on this, we can infer what's happening inside the landfill. The green line here is my rough representation of the landfill cap. The blue at the bottom really doesn't show up very well, but this is leachate from here to here in my cartoon-like drawing. What I showed you in the last slide was when you have air and water in a sealed container with a gas that's going to be partitioned between the two of them. It would take a long time to establish a true equilibrium where you get exactly 270,000 picocuries per liter from a little over 1 million picocuries per liter in the air. If you just got a breeze blowing over radon-contaminated water, that breeze is going to be nowhere near the equilibrium level of 1 million. But if we look at the landfill, we can draw some conclusions here. And there are really two possibilities. One is that the radium that's in the landfill, which of course is the source of the radon that we're seeing and inferring in leachate. That radium in the landfill may be either wet and it's conveying the radon that's coming off of the radium decay to the leachate simply by an all-water pathway. Or the radium may be dry and the radon generated from the radium is then ending up in the air or the mixture of air and landfill gas that's inside the landfill cap. And from the air landfill gas mixture, then some of the radon is dissolving in the leachate based on the partition coefficient or Henry's law principles I've been talking about. So what I'm saying is that it's likely that the it's likely that the radium in the landfill remains dry. That's the intention of the landfill disposal. And it's probably the case that the radium is remaining dry. But if that's the case, that means that the radon emanating from the radium decay has to reach the leachate by an air pathway, or by a pathway that goes through the mixture of air and landfill gas that's within the cap of the landfill. In that case, the radon concentration in the air landfill gas mixture underneath the landfill cap has to actually be more than the 1.05 million picocuries per liter, because that is what is driving the radon into the leachate. In other words, that's the source of the radon that we're finding in the landfill leachate. So it actually has to be greater than the number 1.05 million that I was talking about if the radium in the landfill remains dry in the pathway for the radon is through the air landfill gas mixture. The other possibility is that the radon is moving through an all-water pathway if the radium in the landfill is indeed wet, as it shouldn't be according to good landfill practice. In that case, it could be considerably less than 1.05 million picocuries per liter radon in the air landfill gas mixture. But either one of these possibilities, either something over 1 million picocuries per liter landfill gas, radon in the landfill gas, or radium being wet in the landfill, either of those is something that needs to be looked into. So here again, more testing is needed not only on the leachate per se, but on what's going on inside the landfill and what the radon and also radium levels are that are leading to what we find in the leachate. So important points here, you can read this for yourself, I think, but testing is needed to figure out whether, how often, and what the circumstances are for having more than 1 million picocuries per liter radon in the gas underneath the landfill cap. We also need some testing and dispersion modeling to figure out whether this radon is simply going to politely stay put under the landfill cap, or whether some of it is moving downwind toward downwind locations, possibly including downwind residences. There are certainly widely available air dispersion models that can and should be run to figure out what happens downwind if there is indeed a plume of radon that either intermittently or continuously. Radon in the leachate also needs attention. It will not be extremely long-lived in leachate, because if a leachate sample is collected or if leachate is taken off in a truck, the radon will continue to decay at its 3.82-day half-life, gradually becoming lead-214, bismuth-214, and the other radionuclides further on down the chain. And for the long-term future, as I said, radium in the landfill is going to be an issue for thousands of years into the future. We really need to get a better handle on how much is actually in the landfill. That cannot be directly ascertained at this point from either the leachate results or from the truck monitor results I'm going to talk about next. This slide just shows three well-known three well-known air dispersion models that are used for all sorts of things, not just radon. There's also a couple of papers, at least by researchers, that deal specifically with radon dispersion modeling. And you can also see this rather interesting quote I just happened to come across that I had not been previously aware of about radon possibly being released from the ground in bursts that would move downwind as radon clouds. If indeed the radon within the landfill is only intermittently high, what's happening to it? Are there actually times when some is escaping, but other times it is relatively well contained within the landfill? Again, we don't know without further testing. So moving toward the end here, let's just talk briefly about the monitor's use of the landfill gate. And the purpose of these is to detect any truckload of waste that's carrying more than 25 picocuries per gram. Here we're talking about per gram, not per liter. But as described in the affidavit that I prepared for the Sierra Club on this matter, the monitoring that's being done at the landfill gate is not really adequate to answer this question as to whether truckloads are truly being limited to 25 picocuries per gram of radium or not. The problem is that waste truckloads with about a 60-fold variation, in other words, about a factor of 60 variation, could pass through the gate, and the monitor could not tell the difference between approximately 1 and approximately 60 times that number. So regardless of what the initial number is, if it's 25, it would be 25 times 60. There's a 60-fold knowledge gap there that the current monitoring system is not able to deal with. And even if we narrow that range of 60 down to about 8, I could explain later if anyone is interested why I pick 8, but if we even narrow that down to a factor of 8, let's say that the lower limit is supposed to be 25, but the monitor is unable to distinguish whether the load is actually carrying 8 times as much. We'll leave 60 behind at the moment, but 8 times as much. That would mean that a truckload with up to 200 picocuries per gram radium could enter without triggering the monitor system. And 200 is a pretty hefty concentration of radium compared, for example, to natural background in local soils and rocks, which is around 1 picocurie per gram. And there's also EPA circular guidance that residential construction should not be done on soils containing more than about not more than about 5 picocuries per gram radium above the natural background, which in this case is about 1. So that limit would suggest a limit of about 6 picocuries per gram before you can and should build any residential housing. It would be a serious mistake to proceed with a landfill that is going to end up with at least pockets of radium up around 200 picocuries per gram for the reasons I just explained. That would then be an uncontrolled landfill for thousands of years, because a C&D landfill, unlike one that's really designed for radioactive waste disposal, is not being asked to comply with the same type of safeguards that long-term radioactive waste disposal sites are. So 200 picocuries per gram should not be allowed into a landfill, in my opinion. And the truck monitor that's currently installed is not able to maintain the limit of 25 as it's supposed to. Again, I could explain this in more detail, but even in my longer version talk, I hadn't explained to go into full detail on this. You deserve a break, I think. So conclusions here. Exposure pathways have not been clearly identified or adequately investigated. High levels of radon in the landfill and its leachate may cause some level of human exposure at downwind locations. We really don't know what the levels are, and that's the first step toward establishing what the health effects might be. The radium also in the landfill may pose long-term health risks for thousands of years, simply because the radium has such a long half-life. It's not going to decay away anytime soon. And that's a real concern if the landfill integrity over even decades or hundreds of years cannot be guaranteed, let alone thousands of years. So again, what risk levels are likely to be encountered by people in the distant future using the types of radiation exposure models that are widely recognized and widely used for radioactive waste disposal sites. So the current unknowns and the exposure pathways, and then beyond that, the health impacts, can and should be identified and quantified by testing and modeling. preferably with an EAS process. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I don't know if I'm the last one, but there are going to be questions as we go along. Yes?
So I heard what you say is the radar lasts approximately 3 days. If it's airborne, I can see that that can travel quite a distance in 3 days. But if it's getting into the groundwater, how far would that, I mean, not surface water, but it's groundwater, for the aquifer, how far can that travel in 3 days?
Groundwater, as you know, is much lower in the rate at which it percolates through rock. It depends partly on whether it's within solid rock or whether it's within sand and gravel, where it'd be a lot faster. But still going to be much slower than, you know, a breeze of air passing by. So the radon itself is not likely to go very far in groundwater. But if the radon is dissolved in groundwater, which is what we're talking about in this question, then its decay products, the lead-214, the bismuth-214, and then the longer-lived ones, such as lead-210, I think, is one of the ones of concern further down the decay chain. Those will generally be present unless there's some chemical reason that they would be stripped out, but most likely they would continue with the groundwater for a number of years. So the real concern is not the radon per se, but the radon decay products, especially the longer-lived ones that have 210 as the mass number.
I also want to thank our videographers, Dave Walzak